Hi guys, Mimi G here with another sew along. Today we're going to be working on one of my new fall patterns, 8749. We're going to do view B or C. The only difference is the length of the jacket. You decide how long or short you want it. Let's get started. Now, if you're new to sewing, you might want to check out my online sewing school, sewacademy.com, where we teach in-depth online sewing lessons. Now, if you just need a refresher course, you can visit the Sewing Basics video linked in the description box below. Watch that, then come back and sew along with me. Okay guys, we're working on 8749. I'm going to do the shorter version of the jacket. On the back of the envelope, of course, you have a list of fabric suggestions and any notions that you're going to need. Let's go over the pieces you're going to need to get started. You're going to need pattern piece number 14. This is the front facing. You're going to need to cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 19, which is the undersleeve. You're cutting 2 of fabric and 2 of lining. Pattern piece number 18, which is the upper sleeve. You're also cutting 2 of fabric and 2 of lining. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 10. This is the flap. You're going to cut 4 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. You're going to cut out 4 of pattern piece number 12, which is our pocket. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 15, which is the back facing. You're going to cut 1 on the fold. You're going to also cut 1 on the fold of interfacing. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 17, our under collar. You're going to cut 1 on the fold of fabric, 1 on the fold of interfacing. You're going to cut pattern piece number 16, which is the upper collar. You're going to cut 1 on the fold of fabric and 1 on the fold of interfacing. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 9. This is the front of our jacket. You're going to cut 2 of fabric. Then you're going to cut out pattern piece number 13, which is our back, and you're going to cut 2. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 20, which is our front lining. You're cutting this out of lining. And finally, pattern piece number 21, which is our back lining. You're going to cut 2 out of lining fabric. Once you have everything cut out of your fabric, your lining, and your pieces interfaced, we can get started. Okay, we're going to start by making our welt before we start anything else. Now, you'll notice that my front piece is completely interfaced. The reason I did that is because the fabric that I'm using, the suiting I decided on, is really lightweight, and I wanted to add more body to the front of my jacket, so I went ahead and interfaced the entire fronts. Now make sure that you've marked your bounding box onto the front of your jacket. You should also have marked all of your dots and placement lines on your flap, on your welt piece, and also on your pocket. The first thing I want you to do is to take your welt, you're going to fold it in half, wrong sides facing, and you're going to give it a good press. Once you have your welt folded in half and pressed, you're going to go ahead and grab your flap. With right sides facing, you're going to pin. And now I want you to head over to your sewing machine. Using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to sew down the side, around the bottom, and up the other side. Okay, so the most important thing about doing your welt is to make sure that you are lining up your dots, okay? That's really what's going to make this a lot easier for you. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to match the knots that are on your welt to the bottom part of your bounding box, the 2 dots at the bottom. So the way I like to do it is I put my pin through the dots on my welt, and then I find those dots on my fabric, and then I pin. That way I know for sure that my dots are in the right place. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to stitch in between our dots. Okay, so my needle is right at my dot, and I'm going to use a basting stitch just to hold this in place. I'm not back stitching. I'm going to stop right at my dot. Okay, now go ahead and trim your seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. Now you're going to grab your welt and you're going to match the dots that are on your welt to the dot on your jacket. So I'm going to match one up first, and I'm going to pin. And now again, you're going to sew from dot to dot. Now go ahead and trim this seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Okay, now you're gonna get one of your pocket bags, and what you're going to do is you're going to match up your dots to the dots that you have on your welt and on your flap. Again, I use the same method. I use my pins so that I know I'm exactly where I should be. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to make our bounding box along that little box you should have marked. Mine is very light in yellow, so you might not see it very much, but you should have your little bounding box. We're going to start in the middle of the bounding box, work our way around. Okay, again, I'm starting in the middle of my bounding box, not at a corner. I'm also using a smaller stitch, so I'm down to a 2.0 instead of 2.5. Start stopping right at my dot and pivot. Stopping at the dot and pivot. Stop where you started stitching and backstitch. Okay, so now we're going to cut our bounding box. So you want to start and stop a half inch in from your bounding box. I'm going to use my rotary cutter. I'm cutting through all layers, stopping a ½ inch from the end, and then I'll use my scissors to cut diagonally towards my dots. Now don't cut through your stitching. Now you're going to pull your entire pocket to the inside. Pull the ends of your welt. And now you're going to take this over to your ironing table and you're going to press this into submission, okay? You want to press everything really nice and flat. Okay, so after you press it, this is what your welt should look like on the outside, okay? Here's your welt and here's your flap. And then on the back, this is what it should look like finally fully pressed, okay? So you want to make sure everything is nice and flat and pressed. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tack down the sides of my welt. So what I do is I just move everything to the side and I'm literally just going to tack my little triangles that you should have here through all thicknesses just along that existing stitching line. I'm going to do that on both sides. So I have my jacket and everything to the left of me. I'm only working on the pocket bag on my little triangle here, and then underneath here you can see the welt. And I'm just going to go along that stitching, just tacking it down. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now you're just going to grab your other pocket bag, you're going to lay it over the top, match your notches at the bottom. You're just going to go ahead and pin. And now only sewing your pocket bags together, you're going to sew all the way around using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, you're going to go ahead and do your other welt the same way for your other front. And now we're going to go ahead and clip into our neck. So along your neckline, you should have marked your dots. You're going to make a stitching line 5/8 of an inch from the edge and then up again on the side. And what you're going to do is you're going to clip into that corner. Make sure you don't go past your stitching. just like that. You're going to do that for both fronts. Now go ahead and grab your back pieces. For your back with right sides facing, you're going to go ahead and pin down the entire center back. Make sure your notches are matching. And now head over to your sewing machine. You're just going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, once you have your center back sewn, I want you to go ahead and press your seams flat. Now you're going to take your front and you're going to place it right sides facing. You're going to pin your shoulders. And then you're going to go ahead while you're here and pin your side seam. You're going to pin the other front to the back the same way. Now go ahead to your sewing machine. You're going to stitch across your shoulder using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then down your side seam also using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, we're going to go ahead and attach our under collar. So it's really, really important that you transfer all of your dots and your notches so that you don't get confused. You have a single notch here on the lapel. You have a single notch on your under collar. You have 2 dots here and 2 dots here. You need to match that up. So first I'm going to match up my notch. I'm going to put a pin. I'm just going to double check to make sure that the dot is in the right place on both sides. And now you're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance between your dots. Okay, I have my collar, under collar attached, sewn between my dots. You're going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to match my single notch. And now again, you're going to stitch in between your dots, and then I want you to press your seams open. Okay, now you might have noticed that you have a dart here, right, that we made the markings for. It's on your pattern piece. We're going to sew this in one continuous stitch. So first you want to match up your center back notches to the ones on your collar. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin at the end of my dart. And you should have 2 dots for your dart, so you're going to make sure that you're going through both. And I'm just going to pin there to hold it in place. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to start at the center and I'm going to work my way till I reach the end of my dart. Just as if you were sewing a dart, you're going to sew right off it, tie it off at the end. Then I'm going to go back to the center and I'm going to stitch in the other direction. Okay, I'm going to start in the center, I'm going to back stitch. Now go ahead and tie off your dart. And then I'm going to go again, starting in the center back and working my way in the other direction, just the same way we did for the other side. Okay, so I went ahead and snipped so I can make sure that I can press this open. I'm just going to make a little snip. Now go ahead and press your entire seam open. Okay, once you've given everything a good press, you should have no puckers. Your line should be nice and flat. Your seams should be flat. Everything nicely pressed. We can set this aside. We're going to start working on our sleeves. Okay, you're going to go ahead and grab your undersleeve and your upper sleeve, and you're going to place them right sides facing. You're going to pin first in between your notches. So you have a notch here, and then you have another notch here. Now you're going to notice that you're going to have some ease, right? One is obviously bigger than the other. This is because we're going to need to ease this in. This gives your elbow room, so when you move your arm, you have some flexibility in this area. Okay, once you have this pinned, I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side. Just pull it over. Pin your notch. Go ahead and pin your other sleeve the same way. Head over to your sewing machine. You're just making a straight stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on one side, and then move on over to the other side and again stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So go ahead and press your seams open once you have both of your sleeves sewn. I also went ahead and I created the 2 rows of easing stitch for my sleeve cap. I'm going to set this aside for just 1 second. Now before we attach our sleeve, I'm going to have you create your sleeve heading. You add this to the sleeve cap on your shoulder so that when you wear it, your shoulder doesn't collapse. And so all you need is either some remnant piece of felt or fleece if you have it handy. What you're going to do is you're going to measure between your dots, okay? So just take your tape measure, measure from dot to dot times 2 inches. So I've already cut mine because the distance between my dots is 7 inches by 2. And then I went ahead and cut it in half. So now I have 2 sleeve heads. Now set these aside. We're going to use them once we attach our sleeve to our bodice. So you're going to go ahead and grab your jacket. You're going to need to pull some of your 2 easing threads, but don't pull too much because we don't want any gathering. You're just easing it a little bit. So I just tug just a tad and then I distribute that fullness. Also, you may have noticed that in the instructions and in most of your patterns, you usually ease stitch between the 2 dots. I always find that I get a better sleeve cap if I ease from notch to notch. So I actually do my ease stitching from where my double notch is all the way to my single notch. Okay, and I'm going to turn my sleeve right side out. And you're going to match up single notch to single notch, right sides facing obviously, and then double notch. So single notch, and then I'm going to match and align my double notch. And now I'll go ahead and work from the inside. I always make a notch at the center of my shoulder, so I know exactly where to pin it to my shoulder seam. And then go ahead and pin matching your dots. I want to make sure that I don't get any puckers on my sleeve cap, so I use a lot of pins to distribute that even after easing it in. Once you have it pinned, you're going to go ahead and you're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, we're going to go ahead and pin our sleeve heading to our sleeve cap the way you see here. So I'm going to show you on my other sleeve. You're going to first pin right in the middle. And now all you're going to do is you're going to go to your sewing machine and following your existing stitching, you're going to stitch in about an eighth of an inch from where that stitching is, just along where your sleeve heading is. All right, so I'm going to start sewing, and I'm literally like an eighth of an inch in toward where my stitching is. I'm going to back stitch. You're going to stitch your other sleeve head the same way. Okay, once you have your sleeve headings in, we can go ahead and start on our facing. I'm going to set my jacket aside for a second. You're going to grab your back facing and your front facings. You're going to place right sides facing, matching the notches both on your back facing and on the shoulder of your front facing. Now go ahead and stitch across using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then press your seams open. Okay, once you have it pressed, you're going to go ahead and cut into your corners just like we did for our jacket. And we're going to set this aside. Now you're going to go ahead and stitch your lining pieces basically the same way that you did your jacket. The sleeves are done the same exact way. You're going to stitch front to back at the shoulders and at the side seams, and of course you're going to stitch your center back. All right, I've gone ahead and sewn my lining together, and I went ahead and did a narrow hem along my lining, along the entire bottom of your lining, so go ahead and do that. Now we're going to go ahead and pin our facing to our lining. So I've already done one side, and your lining and your facing have notches, so make sure and align and pin at your notch. And you will notice that your lining will end about 1.5 inches from the bottom of your facing. So if your facing is extending, it's the way it's supposed to be, so don't think something's wrong. Okay, now you're gonna go to your sewing machine, you're gonna start stitching. You're gonna start at the center back, you're gonna stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance along the entire side, and then you're gonna go back to the center back and then do the same thing on the other side. Okay, I went ahead and pressed my seam allowances all the way around towards my lining, gave it a good press. Now we're gonna attach our upper collar to our facing, and you're gonna do that similar to how we did it to the bodice of the jacket. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna match those double notches that you should have, both on your jacket lining and on your upper collar, and then you're gonna pin at your dots. You're gonna stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance between your dots, then you're going to pin the other side the same way. Okay, now you're gonna continue pinning the collar to your facing, matching the center back notches that you have. You should have a dot for your shoulder. And we cut into that corner, so you should have this little cutout here. Okay, now head over to your sewing machine. You're just going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, once you have your upper collar attached to your facing, go ahead, press your seams open, and now we're gonna attach our facing to our jacket. So with right sides facing, I like to have the right side of the jacket facing me. I'm gonna start at the collar first. I'm gonna pin my ends. Now I'm going to go ahead and pin those triple notches, so you should have 3 notches and 3 notches. And now you can continue pinning along the entire front of the jacket. All right, now that we have it fully pinned, we're gonna go ahead and stitch starting in the center back and working our way down one end. I'm gonna show you this part because I want you to get a really nice sharp lapel, and so I wanna make sure that you understand where to start and where to stop sewing. Okay, I'm starting at the center back stitch. We're using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm gonna back stitch when I get to my dot before I pivot. Okay, and so what you're gonna do now is you're gonna stop sewing when you get to this dot. Now you can probably hardly see it because we've been stitching over it, but I'm gonna move the rest of my collar, the peak part of my collar away. I'm gonna stitch. And I'm gonna stop. Now I'm gonna go ahead and bring my seam allowances up. I'm going to place my needle exactly where my dot is. This is why it's so important to mark your dots. I'm making sure that this part is out of the way. Now turn, and you can stitch the rest of the way down using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you're going to do the same thing to the other part of your collar. Make sure to have your seam allowances folded up, stop at the dot, pull your seam allowances up, start at your dot, and then continue on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clip into my corners, remove some of this excess. Now before we turn this over, we're going to finish off the bottom. So what you're going to do is you're going to stitch across at the hem allowance, which is 1 1/4 inch. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and trim this off to 5/8 of an inch from where we did our stitching. I'm going to cut down my corner. Now you can go ahead and turn your jacket right side out. Make sure to push out your corners of your peak collar. All right, give everything a really nice press, and also make sure that you press the bottom as well. And then I went ahead and pressed my hem allowance. I'm going to hand stitch that in place. After I'm all done, that'll be the last thing that you do. But right now what we're going to do is finish off the hem of our sleeve. And so what you want to do is make sure that your sleeve is inside, your sleeve lining is inside of your sleeve. And you want to make sure that you're matching up the seam lines, okay? This is really important. You don't want your sleeve to be twisted on the inside. What you're going to do is you're going to fold under on both your lining and your facing, and your sleeve, I should say. I'm going to hold that in place. I'm going to put my hand through my lining, in between my sleeve and my lining, and I'm going to pinch what I have in my hand. Now you're going to see I still have it pinched, and with right sides facing, we're just going to carefully pin all the way around. Once you're done pinning, it should look like this. Now go ahead and head to your sewing machine, and you're going to stitch around using the hem allowance allowed, which is 1 1/4 inch, all the way around. Okay, back stitch to the beginning and at the end. It's a tight space, so just go slow. Trim off some of your seam allowance and turn your sleeve right side out. Now once you turn your sleeve to the right side, you'll see you have really nicely finished on the inside. And the last thing for you to do, like I said earlier, is to go ahead and hand stitch your hem in place. After you do that, you are all done. Well, that's all there is to it. I hope you've enjoyed this sew along, and please make sure and follow me on Instagram @MimiGStyle, and please use the hashtag MimiGPatterns. Until next time, peace.